Imagine being trapped in a dark bunker in the Pacific jungle. The enemy is meters away. Your weapon jams, you're dead. But what if there was a weapon so brutal, so efficient, that the Japanese themselves tried to ban it as a war crime? This is the true story of how obsessed US Navy mechanics transformed a simple hunting rifle into one of the most feared weapons of World War II. An illegal modification that saved thousands of American lives and terrorized the Empire of Japan. Prepare to learn the truth behind the legendary trench gun. When US Marines landed on Guadalcanal in August 1942, they quickly realized they were fighting a completely different war than in Europe. The dense jungle of the South Pacific created combat conditions that no military manual had predicted. Lieutenant Colonel Louis Chesty Puller, who commanded the 1st Battalion of the 7th Marine Regiment, described the situation in his reports. Engagements occurred at distances of 5 to 10 meters. The standard M1 Garand guns were excellent in open terrain, but in the dense tropical vegetation, they were too long and too slow. The Japanese had built an elaborate network of underground bunkers and fortifications. These structures were small, claustrophobic, with narrow corridors where traditional rifles were useless. The Marines had to clear each bunker, each tunnel, each fortified position, meter by meter. Sergeant Manila John Basilone, who would later receive the Medal of Honor, recounted in post-war interviews the deadly frustration. Soldiers would enter bunkers with rifles and bayonets, only to be massacred in hand-to-hand combat. The casualty rate in bunker-clearing operations was terrifying. In the first weeks of combat, it became clear that the Americans needed something different, something brutal, something that would work in confined spaces. The answer lay with the gunsmiths, a weapon that had been used in the First World War, the Winchester Model 1897. But there was a critical problem. Standard rifles were not designed for the extreme humidity, mud, and corrosive conditions of the tropical jungle. After days of combat, these weapons would begin to malfunction. The pump action mechanism would jam, the stockwood would swell and crack, rust would consume the metal parts. The Marines faced an impossible choice: use weapons unsuitable for close combat, or use rifles that failed at the most critical moment. Both options meant death. It was in this desperate context that a group of field mechanics and armorers began experimenting. They had no official authorization, they had no technical manuals, they had no adequate spare parts. But they had one thing: Marines were dying every day because their weapons didn't work. Captain Samuel Griffith, an intelligence officer who served on Guadalcanal, documented the emergence of these unauthorized modifications in his personal diaries. Field armorers began completely disassembling the Winchester 1897 and 1912 rifles, studying each component and testing different configurations. The initial modifications were simple but effective. They shortened the barrels to improve maneuverability in tight spaces. They removed the wooden stock, replacing it with improvised versions made of metal or available synthetic materials. They applied anti-corrosion treatments using whatever material they could find, from motor oil to experimental greases. But these initial modifications were just the beginning. As more Marines tested the modified weapons in actual combat, more feedback reached the armorers. And among these obsessive mechanics, one man began to stand out for the audacity and ingenuity of his modifications. His true identity remained obscured for decades, protected by military secrecy because many of his modifications violated technical regulations. But his work changed the course of the war in the Pacific. The Field Armament Workshop on Guadalcanal was no sophisticated setting. Set up under tarpaulins stretched between palm trees, sheltered from the scorching sun and torrential rains, this operation ran 24 hours a day. The distant roar of Japanese artillery was the constant soundtrack to the work. Technical Sergeant Mitchell Page, another Medal of Honor recipient who fought at Guadalcanal, described the scene in his memoirs. Dozens of disassembled weapons scattered on makeshift tables, mechanics working by lamplight as darkness fell, testing each modification before returning the weapons to the Marines. The gunsmiths developed an informal but efficient feedback system. Marines who used the modified rifles in combat returned with detailed reports. What worked, what failed, what could be improved. This cycle of design, real combat testing, and refinement accelerated the evolution of the modifications. One of the most important innovations was the development of an improved sealing system. Tropical humidity penetrated every opening of the gun, causing rust and jams. Mechanics began experimenting with shredded tire rubber, creating custom seals to protect the internal mechanisms. Colonel Merritt Edson, commander of the 1st Raider Battalion, quietly authorized these unregulated modifications. He understood that regulations written in Washington did not reflect the reality of jungle combat. In his official reports, he avoided mentioning the specific modifications, but emphasized the superior effectiveness of the rifles in close combat. The mechanics also modified the feeding system. The original Winchesters used standard ammunition that sometimes jammed when exposed to moisture. They adjusted the chambers to accept cartridges with wider tolerances, reducing feeding failures. Some experimented with different types of ammunition, creating custom loads for maximum effectiveness in bunkers. The most controversial modification was the so-called slam fire mode. The Winchester 1897 rifles had a feature where, by holding the trigger down, the weapon would fire automatically each time the action was pumped. This feature had been removed in later models for safety reasons. Field mechanics deliberately reactivated it. Why? In a dark bunker with enemies meters away, the ability to fire continuously while pumping the action was the difference between life and death. A trained Marine could fire 6 shots in less than 3 seconds, creating a devastating volume of fire in confined spaces. Major General Alexander Vandergrift, commander of the 1st Marine Division, visited the weapons workshop in September 1942. Witnesses report that he observed a demonstration of the modified rifles and simply said, "Keep the work going, don't tell me the details." This tacit approval allowed gunsmiths to go even further in their experimentation. They began modifying not only existing weapons, but creating completely customized variants for specific missions. For night operations, they developed versions with rudimentary aiming systems that functioned in darkness. For clearing caves, they created configurations with extremely short barrels that allowed for maneuverability in tunnels. For defensive positions, they assembled versions with increased ammunition capacity. Each modification was immediately tested in combat. Marines became partners in the design process, offering suggestions based on life-or-death experiences. This collaboration between mechanics and combatants created a cycle of innovation that formal military structures could never replicate. But among all the mechanics who worked in these makeshift workshops, there was one who stood out for his almost manic obsession with perfection. His colleagues called him the Madman because of the endless hours he spent refining every detail. As the Pacific Campaign progressed through the Solomon Islands, the reputation of the modified rifles grew among the Marines. Stories circulated about the brutal effectiveness of these weapons in close combat. In the Battle of Tarawa, in November 1943, Colonel David Shoup led the 2nd Marine Regiment in one of the bloodiest amphibious assaults of the war. His Marines faced Japanese bunkers constructed of coconut logs and concrete, virtually impenetrable to conventional small arms. Shoup specifically requested modified rifles for his assault teams. In his post-battle reports, he credited these weapons as crucial to clearing Japanese fortifications. The ability to fire multiple lead charges in rapid succession inside enclosed bunkers was simply devastating. The Japanese began to specifically fear these rifles. Captured documents revealed that Japanese commanders warned their troops about thundergun Marines, who could clear a fortified position in seconds. Prisoners of war reported the psychological terror of the characteristic sound of Winchesters being pumped. But it wasn't just regular Marines who wanted these weapons. Elite units, including the Marine Raiders and Paramarine battalions, began requesting specific versions. Each unit had different preferences based on its operational tactics. Lieutenant Colonel Evans Carlson, commander of the 2nd Raider Battalion, worked directly with armorers to develop ultra-compact versions for deep reconnaissance operations. These missions required Marines to carry minimal equipment through hostile jungle for days. The compact rifles offered devastating firepower without the weight of conventional rifles. During the raid on Makin Atoll in August 1942, Carlson's raiders made extensive use of the modified rifles. In declassified reports decades later, veterans described how they managed to neutralize Japanese positions that would have caused massive casualties if attacked with conventional weapons. The demand for these modified weapons began to exceed the capacity of the field workshops. Marines returning from combat often refused to return their customized rifles, creating an informal barter economy. A modified Winchester could be traded for extra rations, leave, or other favors. This unofficial demand caught the attention of higher-ups. Supply officials began questioning why so many rifles were disappearing from official inventories. Informal investigations revealed the extent of the unauthorized modifications. Admiral Chester Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet, was briefed on the situation in 1943. Instead of suppressing the modifications, he ordered the Navy to officially study the field adaptations. This marked a significant shift in official stance. Navy engineers were sent to document the modifications. They were surprised by the sophistication of the adaptations developed by mechanics without formal training in weapons design. Some solutions to corrosion and reliability problems were more effective than developments in formal laboratories. But field mechanics were wary of this official attention. They feared that military bureaucracy would eventually standardize the modifications, eliminating the flexibility that made the weapons so effective. Each theater of operations had unique challenges. What worked on Guadalcanal might not work on Iwo Jima. Among the mechanics, the unofficial leader continued refining his creations. Veterans who served in the Pacific remember a particular gunsmith whose modifications were the most sought after. Marines waited weeks to have their weapons specifically worked on by him. His reputation was such that battalion commanders occasionally intervened to ensure their units received priority. This created tensions, but it also demonstrated the recognized value of his work. The Battle of Peleliu in September 1944 tested the modified rifles under extreme conditions. The island was a fortress, with the Japanese having built over 500 fortified caves connected by tunnels. General William Rupertus predicted that the island would be taken in 4 days. The battle lasted more than 2 months. The 1st Marine Regiment, commanded by Colonel Louis Chesty Puller, faced the worst of the fighting. The Japanese caves were deep, with multiple levels and exits. Clearing each fortification required entering narrow tunnels where the fighting took place in complete darkness. Corporal Eugene Sledge, whose memoirs later became the book With the Old Breed, vividly described the use of rifles at Peleliu. He recounts how riflemen armed with modified Winchesters were always the first to enter the caves. The sound of the rifles echoing through the tunnels became the soundtrack of the battle. Conditions on Peleliu were even worse than on Guadalcanal. The heat was stifling, frequently exceeding 45 degrees Celsius. The humidity was extreme, but the biggest challenge was the pulverized coral that covered everything. This fine dust penetrated any mechanism, causing abrasion and jamming. Field armorers had to adapt quickly. They developed new cleaning and maintenance methods specific to the coral reef environment. Some modifications included additional coverings over moving parts and quick cleaning systems that allowed field maintenance in minutes. Major Raymond Davis, who commanded the 1st Battalion of the 1st Regiment, maintained a dedicated armorer in his unit specifically to keep the rifles operational. This armorer worked continuously, sometimes under enemy fire, to ensure the weapons were always ready. A crucial innovation developed at Peleliu was the coordinated use of rifles with flamethrowers. Assault teams developed tactics where riflemen with Winchester rifles covered the flamethrower operators. When the flamethrower launched fire into a cave, riflemen with rifles waited at the exits to neutralize any enemy attempting to escape. This tactic was brutal but effective. It significantly reduced American casualties during cave-clearing operations. Lieutenant Colonel Harold "Bucky" Harris credited these coordinated tactics with saving hundreds of Marine lives. During the battle, one particular situation tested the limits of the modifications. Sergeant Hank Bauer, who would later become a professional baseball player, was leading a team clearing a particularly large cave complex. His rifle jammed after continuous firing in a tunnel filled with smoke and dust. Unable to clean the weapon in the darkness of the tunnel, Bauer used the rifle as a club, fighting hand-to-hand until his team could retreat. When he finally emerged, the unit's armorer completely disassembled the weapon, discovering that coral had created an abrasive paste that jammed the mechanism. This incident led to another round of modifications. Gunsmiths developed a quick washing system using seawater to remove coral dust before it could form the problematic paste. Marines began carrying small bottles of water specifically for cleaning their rifles. General Roy Geiger, commander of the 3rd Amphibious Corps, visited Peleliu during the battle. He personally observed the cave-clearing operations and was impressed by the effectiveness of the modified rifles. In his post-action report, he officially recommended expanding the modification program. This high-level recommendation finally brought official recognition to the work of the field armorers. But it also brought scrutiny. Researchers wanted to identify exactly who was making these modifications and how. In December 1944, a diplomatic incident nearly ended the entire modified rifle program. The Japanese government, through neutral channels, lodged a formal complaint alleging that the United States was violating the 1925 Geneva Protocols. The Japanese claim was specific. The modified rifles constituted prohibited weapons under international conventions. In particular, they argued that the use of lead ammunition in close combat caused unnecessary suffering. The irony of this complaint did not go unnoticed by the Americans. Japan had committed well-documented atrocities across the Pacific, including massacres of civilians and brutal treatment of prisoners of war. But diplomatically, the complaint had to be taken seriously. The U.S. State Department requested reports from the War Department regarding the use of rifles. This investigation revealed for the first time to the highest levels of government the extent of unauthorized modifications being made in the field. Officials from the Judge Advocate General Corps were sent to the Pacific to investigate. Colonel J. Williams, a senior military attorney, conducted extensive interviews with Marines and armorers. His report, declassified in 1998, reveals the details of this investigation. Williams discovered that the modifications were far more extensive than Washington had imagined. It wasn't just a few isolated weapons, but thousands of modified rifles in use throughout the Pacific theater. More concerning from a legal standpoint, some modifications clearly violated American military regulations, let alone international conventions. The dilemma was real. Banning the modified rifles would increase American casualties, but continuing their use could create problematic legal precedents and give propaganda ammunition to Japan. General Douglas MacArthur, Supreme Commander of Allied forces in the Southwest Pacific, took a firm stance. In a memorandum dated January 1945, he argued that rifles were legitimate weapons of war and that Japan lacked the moral authority to make complaints about military brutality. Admiral Nimitz agreed, but more cautiously. He ordered that the modifications be revised to ensure technical compliance with the laws of war. Specifically, the use of non-standard ammunition was restricted. This order created practical challenges. Field armorers had to balance operational effectiveness with regulatory compliance. Some of the most effective modifications were precisely those considered legally questionable. The lead mechanic, whose identity was still officially unknown, faced a difficult choice. He could continue making the life-saving modifications or adhere strictly to the new guidelines that limited the effectiveness of the weapons. Veterans who served during this period report that modifications continued but became more subtle. Gunsmiths developed modifications that achieved the same results through technically different methods, creating technical conformity while maintaining practical effectiveness. Captain John Thomason, an intelligence officer who served as a liaison between field units and higher command, described this situation as creative obedience. Formally, directives were followed. In practice, the rifles remained as lethal as before. The diplomatic controversy eventually faded when it became clear that Japan was losing the war. In March 1945, with the invasion of Okinawa approaching, priorities shifted dramatically. Washington's attention turned to preparing the largest amphibious operation of the Pacific War. But the legal investigation had a lasting effect. For the first time, there was detailed official documentation about the modifications. This documentation would be crucial decades later when historians tried to reconstruct the history of these weapons. The lead mechanic, despite the risk of legal consequences, continued his work. For him, the math was simple. Every rifle he improved potentially saved the life of an American Marine. No regulation or investigation would change that fundamental equation. The Battle of Okinawa, beginning in April 1945, would be the ultimate test for the modified rifles. The island was larger, more populated, and more heavily defended than any previous objective. The Japanese had built the most elaborate defense of the war, with over 60,000 soldiers entrenched in massive underground fortifications. General Simon Bolivar Buckner Jr., commander of the 10th Army, oversaw the largest American amphibious force to that point. Among his troops were veterans of Guadalcanal, Tarawa, and Peleliu, Marines who had complete confidence in their modified rifles. The Shuri Castle Cave complex was particularly challenging. The Japanese had excavated kilometers of tunnels through the limestone, creating an underground fortress that could house thousands of soldiers. Conventional artillery was almost useless against these positions. Major General Pedro del Valle, commanding the 1st Marine Division, requisitioned all available modified rifles. He understood that taking Shuri would require prolonged underground combat under impossible conditions. The armorers worked day and night preparing weapons for battle. But they faced a new challenge: ammunition supply. The volume of fire expected in Okinawa would exceed any previous operation. Rifle ammunition was a lower priority than rifle and artillery ammunition. The chief mechanic devised an ingenious solution. He modified some rifles to accept multiple ammunition calibers, allowing riflemen to use captured or improvised stocks. This flexibility would be crucial when supply lines were disrupted. First, Lieutenant Robert Sheeks led a platoon during the assault on Shuri. His post-operation report describes tunnel combat lasting for hours. His team cleared over 20 fortified positions in a single day using only modified rifles. Sheiks reported that the most valuable modification was the ability to fire rapidly in confined spaces. In tunnels where two people could barely fit side by side, the difference between firing 6 shots in 3 seconds versus 6 seconds was literally the difference between life and death. The battle also revealed limitations. The extreme heat inside the tunnels after continuous firing caused the weapons to overheat. Some Marines suffered severe burns from touching overheated barrels. Field armourers quickly improvised thermal covers using available materials. Sergeant R.V. Bergen, whose platoon fought through some of the worst areas of Shuri, described how they developed specific tactics. Teams alternated riflemen with shotguns to allow the weapons to cool down between engagements. This coordination saved lives and kept the weapons operational. During 82 days of brutal combat, the modified rifles proved their worth repeatedly. Conservative estimates suggest that Marines armed with these weapons were responsible for clearing more than 60% of Japanese fortifications on Okinawa, but the human cost was terrible. Okinawa resulted in over 12,000 Marines killed and over 36,000 wounded. Many of the most experienced Marines, those who had fought since Guadalcanal, were killed in the final weeks of the battle. General Buckner was killed by Japanese artillery fire in June 1945, just days before the island was declared secure. His death symbolized the ultimate sacrifice of Okinawa. For the gunsmiths who kept the rifles operational, the battle was equally grueling. Working under constant fire, often in forward positions close to the front lines, they kept the weapons functioning despite impossible conditions. The lead mechanic, whose modifications had saved countless lives, was completely exhausted. Colleagues reported that he worked 20 hours a day, only sleeping when he literally collapsed from fatigue. His obsession with perfection had become an almost suicidal mission. When Okinawa finally fell in June 1945, the modified rifles had cemented their place in American military history. When Japan surrendered in August 1945, the war ended abruptly. The Marines who had fought across the Pacific began the long journey home. But the modified rifles that had served them so well faced an uncertain fate. The War Department initiated a massive decommissioning. Millions of weapons needed to be catalogued, stored, or disposed of. The modified rifles created a bureaucratic dilemma. Technically, they were non-standard weapons that violated arsenal regulations. Supply officers were ordered to identify and segregate all modified weapons. The intention was to remove them from service and destroy them, but many Marines simply refused to return their weapons. Sergeant John Basilone, who had survived Guadalcanal but was killed on Iwo Jima, had written in letters home about his modified rifle. After his death, the weapon was sent to his family, who kept it as a memorial. Dozens of families had similar stories. Some Marines illegally brought their rifles home as war souvenirs. Estimates suggest that hundreds of these modified weapons ended up in private collections, where they remained hidden for decades. The chief mechanic faced his own difficult journey after the war. Without official identification in records, without formal recognition for his work, he simply disappeared into civilian life. Veterans who knew him lost contact, and his story was gradually forgotten. In the 1950s and 1960s, when military historians began studying the Pacific War, the modified rifles were mentioned only in footnotes. Without adequate official documentation, the extent and significance of the modifications remained obscure. It wasn't until the 1980s, when elderly veterans began speaking more openly about their experiences, that the true story began to emerge. Oral interviews revealed details that had never been officially documented. Military historian Joseph Alexander, who wrote extensively on Marine Corps campaigns, was one of the first to recognize the importance of the modifications. In his 1997 book on Peleliu, he dedicated an entire chapter to the modified rifles. Research in declassified files has revealed reports that had been buried for decades. Documents showed that field commanders consistently credited the modified rifles as crucial to the success of close combat operations. A particularly revealing 1946 report by General Alexander Vandergrift argued that field modifications should be officially incorporated into future weapons designs. This report had been ignored at the time, but decades later it validated the work of gunsmiths. Collectors of military weapons began specifically searching for modified wartime Winchester rifles. Some weapons that had been illegally brought home were now worth thousands of dollars. But more importantly, each weapon was a physical artifact of a nearly lost history. In 2003, an 82-year-old veteran contacted the National Museum of the Marine Corps. He had kept his modified rifle for nearly 60 years and wanted to donate it before he died. During the donation, he recounted stories about the gunsmith who had modified the weapon on Guadalcanal. This donation initiated a more systematic search. The museum began actively documenting the history of the modified rifles. Veterans were contacted, documents were compiled, and weapons were located. January 17th, the story of the obsessive mechanic who spearheaded the modifications began to take shape. Multiple veterans mentioned the same individual, always with respect and admiration. But his identity remained elusive. Official records were frustratingly vague. Field armorers were often not named in reports. The secrecy surrounding unauthorized modifications meant that little contemporary documentation existed. The search for the identity of the chief mechanic became almost a mission among a small group of historians and veterans. They knew that time was running out. The last veterans of World War II were in their 90s. The discovery finally came from an unexpected source. In 2008, a woman from Seattle contacted the Marine Corps Museum with a box of documents belonging to her deceased grandfather. Among letters and photographs were detailed diaries of an armorer who served in the Pacific. The journals were extraordinary. Written in worn notebooks with cramped handwriting, they documented in technical detail the modifications made to hundreds of rifles. Each entry included the date, location, weapons serial number, and specifications of the modifications. Most importantly, the diaries identified other gunsmiths by name and described the informal hierarchy that existed among them, and repeatedly the diaries mentioned a specific individual as the group's technical leader. By cross-referencing this information with declassified military records, researchers finally identified the master armorer. They chose not to publish his full name to respect the family's privacy, but confirmed his existence and service. Records showed that he had enlisted in the Navy in 1941 at age 19. Before the war, he worked as a mechanic in an auto repair shop in a small Midwestern town. He had no formal weapons training. His first posting was at Pearl Harbor, where he survived the Japanese attack on December 7th. This experience apparently marked him deeply. Colleagues recalled that he rarely spoke about that day, but developed an almost obsessive determination to contribute to the war effort. He was transferred to Guadalcanal in August 1942 as part of a support unit. Officially, his job was general equipment maintenance, but he quickly began to specialize in weapons, specifically rifles. The diaries reveal a meticulous and creative mind. He not only copied modifications that others had made, but systematically experimented, tested, and documented improvements. His notes show self-taught knowledge of metallurgy, ballistics, and precision mechanics. A veteran who served with him, interviewed in 2010 at age 89, recalled, "He was absolutely obsessed. He worked constantly. Other mechanics rested, played cards. He was always adjusting something, testing some modification." This obsession came at a personal cost. The diaries reveal struggles with extreme fatigue, health problems caused by exposure to chemicals, and social isolation. He sacrificed virtually everything for his work. But they also reveal moments of profound satisfaction. One entry from 1943 describes a Marine returning from combat to personally express his gratitude. The rifle he had modified functioned perfectly during a brutal bunker clearing, saving the lives of the Marine and his team. These personal interactions seem to have motivated his work more than any official order. He viewed each weapon not as an object, but as the potential difference between a Marine living or dying. The diaries also document the more controversial modifications. He was fully aware that some violated regulations. One entry from 1944 questions whether he could face a court-martial if discovered, but he concludes that saving the lives of Marines justified the personal risk. After the war, he returned to his hometown. He married, had children, and worked in the same mechanic shop for 40 years. Neighbors remembered him as quiet and reserved. Few knew about his wartime service. He never spoke publicly about the weapon modifications. When veterans occasionally contacted him to thank him, he would respond politely but briefly. Apparently, he preferred to leave that chapter of his life in the past. He passed away in 1998 at the age of 77 from natural causes. His local obituary mentioned only that he was a World War II veteran who served in the Pacific. Nothing about the thousands of lives his modifications potentially saved. Her family found the diaries years later while cleaning their house. Initially, they didn't understand their significance. It was only when they decided to donate them to the museum that the true story emerged. The history of modified rifles had a lasting impact on American military thinking, although this was not apparent for decades. During the Korean War in the 1950s, Marines again faced combat in bunkers and tunnels, particularly in the northern mountains. They discovered that the lessons of weapons modification from the Pacific had been institutionally forgotten. World War II veterans serving in Korea attempted to replicate the modifications, but without the technical expertise or operational freedom that existed in the Pacific. The result was fragmented and less effective efforts. This experience led the Navy to create the Marine Corps Equipment Board in 1952, specifically tasked with collecting combat feedback and implementing equipment improvements. This formal institution attempted to capture the kind of innovation that had occurred informally during World War II. In Vietnam, rifles once again became relevant for tunnel combat. The famous tunnel rat operations in the Cu Chi tunnel complex used a variety of short-barreled weapons, including modified rifles based on World War II designs. Colonel David Hackworth, a controversial but highly respected officer who served in Vietnam, specifically studied the Pacific modifications. In his book About Face, he argues that the Navy should have institutionalized these lessons instead of letting them die with the veterans. Special forces began to officially recognize the value of field modifications in the 1970s. The development of programs such as the Naval Special Warfare Development Group, SEAL Team 6, included weapons workshops where custom modifications were not only permitted, but encouraged. These elite units essentially resurrected the philosophy of the Pacific armorers. Field operators who understand the needs of combat should have a say in the design and modification of equipment. In the 1980s, the Special Operations Peculiar Modification (SOPMOD) program formalized this concept. It allowed Special Forces operators to modify standard weapons for specific missions with technical supervision but operational flexibility. Captain Larry Vickers, a former Delta Force operator turned weapons instructor, frequently cites the Pacific's modified rifles as an example of user-driven innovation. He argues that military hierarchy often stifles innovation by separating end users from designers. The 2003 invasion of Iraq brought new relevance. Urban combat in cities like Fallujah once again demanded weapons effective in confined spaces. Marines used Benelli M214 rifles, but many modified these weapons in the field, continuing a 60-year tradition. Sergeant Major Bradley Castle, who received the Navy Cross for actions in Fallujah, used a modified rifle during house-to-house combat. His weapon had customizations to the sights, ammunition capacity, and ergonomics that directly echoed modifications from the Pacific. Commercial manufacturers eventually began offering some of these modifications as factory options. Companies like Remington and Mossberg introduced tactical versions of rifles that incorporated lessons learned from decades of field modifications. The military academic community also began studying the phenomenon. Papers on emergent innovation and organizational learning used the modified rifles as a case study on how military organizations can be simultaneously rigid and adaptable.